Welcome to SystemShift, the podcast that explores new ideas and thinking for a sustainable economic future that prioritize the health of the planet and the well-being of all people, not just a select few. Today, we're excited to welcome Eva Von Redecker, a critical theorist and feminist philosopher who is doing groundbreaking work in the field of economic and political philosophy. Eva is a researcher at the University of Verona, where she focuses on critical theory, political philosophy, and feminist theory. Her work is concerned with the fundamental questions of power and inequality and how they are perpetuated by the current economic system. She is also interested in exploring alternative economic systems that prioritize the ecological sustainability and social justice. Her work offers insights into how we can begin to change the current economic system, build something new in its place. She argues that the current economic system is built on a foundation of patriarchy, and we need to dismantle this system in order to build a more just and sustainable world. Her work on feminist economics challenges us to rethink our assumptions about work, value, and care, and prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable in our society. Eva sees the world as being a process of developing planetary ecology, with the question of life being paramount. She writes about the revolution of the purpose of life and how we can reorganize our daily habits to save life rather than continuing to destroy it. Her vision is for capitalism's wheels of fortune to be replaced by a round, blue planet inhabited by people who can determine their own direction of travel within its boundaries. Her work challenges us to reimagine our view on property rights and the economic system and how to build something that is truly sustainable and just. She reminds us that the current economic system is not inevitable and we have the power to create something better. So, without further ado, a warm welcome to you, Eva.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I think we can have an interesting chat about different topics, but when we talked a little bit now, you mentioned you actually just yesterday delivered a book script. So tell us a little bit about this new thing you're going to do.
Oh my God, yes, quite a delivery. That's going to be a small book about freedom, because I just found it somehow totally unbearable that with our current concept of freedom, it seems you can build motorways, but you can't preserve the world. And the fact that the loss of certain very narrow privileges cuts into freedom, but the loss of the world doesn't. Like, I found that, I thought it can't be true. And I also don't want to part with that term. So it's an attempt to develop an ecological notion of freedom, which I think has to be temporal. So it's freedom in time and freedom of having time and freedom of having time that regenerates you. So that's what nature does, right? You have time where something lives and it allows something else also to live. So I call that freedom to stay, to oppose it to freedom of movement, and also, I guess, to provoke a bit. So that's what the book's about. And now I have forgotten everything about it because it's written down and I mustn't think of it because I can't change anything anymore.
But that actually sounds really interesting. And the same goes actually for biodiversity. It really needs space and time to develop and prosper.
Yeah, it's actually the last chapter is about biodiversity, especially of soil. It's partly based on George Monbiot's new book. And I have this idea about that the best way, if you want to have a philosophical abstract term to talk about nature, actually time is a very good category, because all of nature is certain regenerative cycles. So it's this sort of cyclical time where something reproduces itself over and over again, certain species, and you have very different lengths of, some mountains that have been there for 4 million years, and then you have trees that are there for 300 years, and all of that is time. And we need to learn to read and understand that time that we're often destroying and appending without even knowing what it is, what's that is so much inbuilt in the essence of those things.
Soil is an interesting thing. It's an underappreciated microcosmos of life.
It's amazing. I mean, so I grew up on an organic farm, right? So I grew up working the soil, and also my sister studied agriculture. She knows much more about this stuff than I do, probably stealing some of it. But she, the best way to think about soil is not stuff like a heap of sand or something. It's actually a structure that was built by living beings, like for instance, if you have a wasp's nest, it's it's a super complex structure built from the excrements of that insect. And that's just one insect. But soil, under 1 meter of soil, you have like thousands and thousands of species cooperating together to build that thing that then allows to pass the nutrients from indeed the sun and the rotted material to the roots of the plants. And without that, there would be like nothing we could ever eat.
That brings us actually to another interesting aspect of your work, and that's kind of the view of property and value.
Yeah.
So if we continue with the soil analogy, so today, if you value a farmer's work on the world market, is the kilograms of something produced per acre, and if you just put a lot of pesticides and kill all this soil life or much of it, you can see that, oh, this is a productive farm. I get a lot of kilogram output. But this destruction of property or the destruction of the soil is not considered in the equation.
Yeah, no, not at all. I guess I would just say one thing about the farmer on the market. Of course, in Europe, it's also not even just that kind of nicely capitalist evil where it's just the price that determines how they treat the land. We spend a lot of taxpayers' money on the way that agriculture is done. Otherwise, it wouldn't be profitable. And even though that's the case, it's not regulated to be really ecologically sustainable. So that's spectacular. But I think to get to the heart of modern and also capitalist treatment of the world as large, we can actually stay with the soil, because in order to use something at maximum short-term productivity capacity, you need to make it so what philosophers, Hegelian philosophers, sorry to bring up that old guy, call abstract, means you take one thing and take it out of its context. So really, in the original meaning of abstractions, you take something out. Maybe a more normal word would be to say you extract it. You need to sort of extract, for instance, all the nutrients at a very fast pace out of the soil and just take the vegetables away or the soybeans and not return anything to the soil. But a lot of what my work is about is to say that that's not something that can sort of automatically happen. It's not like the land lies there for you to just grab and extract. You need to make it usable or disposable in that way. And the key driver in modernity for making things digestible to capitalism is property, because modern property has a very specific shape that no other society, also not pre-modern Western societies, ever came up with, not even Roman law, but that's a rabbit hole we might not go into. There's a debate about that. And the idea about modern property is you can do whatever you want with it. So it's an object that is like totally at your disposal, at your mercy. It's something that you can treat at will, and you don't have to justify. If it's yours, you will not have to justify it to anyone. You can do what you will. It's also great, right? There are some things with which we might want to have that freedom. Soil is definitely not something that should be part of it. So, and in order for you to have that total control, you of course need to know where it starts and ends, right? Because it's clear you don't have that over the whole world. So I always explain the system we live in with kind of knives or two cuts, and property is the first knife. And that knife always, it's kind of cuts in a circle. It cuts out a thing from its surroundings so that you can say, okay, that piece of land is yours. And now you can do what you want with it. And you can break through all those metabolisms, all the natural cycles, all the way that that piece of land is embedded in the entire ecosystem of the planet. You can just treat that as if it doesn't exist. So that's the first cut. You just think it's like a cookie cutter, like you just get a piece out as if it was separate, and then you start treating it as separate, and then it does get isolated. It's of course how we treat ourselves, right? That's an individual. A piece, like you cut a circle around it. You belong to yourself, but everything else is kind of cut through. And then capitalism, of course, doesn't just give people ownership. The whole thing is driven by seeking profit. And that's, as it were, now comes the knife and slashes the thing through in the middle, because you want to sell something for profit. That's a commodity. So that's the one half that you then kind of try to get rid of for money. But there's always, and classic Marxist theories of capitalism, I think, don't appreciate that enough. There's always another half that you discard. Like you always kind of, whatever you own, you split it into, if you are a capitalist, who wants to sell stuff, you always split it into that's valuable and that you treat as if it wasn't there. For instance, emissions, right? Every production process produces the waste, debris, and also in the last 200 years, emissions. So CO2. And that's just treated as if it wasn't there. And that's the other magic that property allows you to do. You can just say like, oh, I either sell it or I dump it. It's not mine anymore. And that's not something that you can do with it's not natural that you could do that with objects. So if you think you live in a like shared flat or in a family and there's a torn and rotten t-shirt that somebody left on the sofa, and then you're like, can you please tidy your junk? And then your flatmate goes, oh no, I donated to you. It's yours now. It's not my junk anymore. Like you couldn't do that. Right? It would be absurd. But that's how our economy runs overall. And it's permitted by this function of property that you can control, but also discard it.
But also like this logic of even when you want to get rid of something, in many jurisdictions, you're actually not allowed to do dumpster diving to pick up something because even when you consider it as trash, it's still yours.
Yes, exactly. And it mustn't undermine this capitalist principle that you are cut off from any ways of sustaining yourself apart from the market. So it's part of keeping alive that dependency that you need to go to the supermarket and then rather buy some trash, some trash with a price tag on, rather than just show in a way that there is so much affluence in our societies that could be used so that you could more effortlessly, definitely without cash, access it. So I think that's one of the anxieties. And yes, of course, with the waste, because it's still yours in the control sense, but it's not yours often. I mean, obviously, we now have some regulations, but the fact that they are necessary shows that the default paradigm is total unaccountability. And then, if you're happy and lucky and you have a government that sets some regulations, you also cannot dump everything into every river anymore. Of course not. But that needs to be specified. So you can always look for if you want to make money, for the loophole that still exists so that you can, in another way reduce your cost, because that's what capitalist companies have to do. They have to reduce their cost, no matter how well-wishing they are and how they would like to be careful and sort of not dump things. They will then probably be outcompeted by somebody else who manages to produce the same stuff cheaper. So that's this kind of systemic character that drives the whole engine. And with the food waste, it is interesting that this is not waste that is just discarded into oblivion, like the emissions, but that is still protected in some ways against theft eventually. I don't even know the exact recycling or rather non-recycling chain of it, but I mean, a lot of that food, for starters, is plastic wrapped, and that will end up somewhere where it's not doing good to the environment. Like, this stuff doesn't disappear. That's the thing. If you look from the perspective of value, then the trash has it's just kind of non-existence. You just discard it. From the view of those cycles that we talked before, those, I call them tides, so the metabolistic cycles of the biosphere, of all of life, then of course the plastic is there. The rotten food is there, and that is also not good for some animals that feed on it. Then there is the wrapping that is there, the microplastic that gets washed around, eventually is everywhere. We just had that very recent study that now it's in all human milk and all rain. So it stays around and it has effects long after you can tell who the owner is, who you could hold accountable. And even that, what does it help? I mean, there's nothing that one rich bastard could do to fix the problems that we now have. It's part of the tragedy we're in.
Maybe not even a kind rich person would be able to do it. But I'm
no,
wondering.
And I think some kind rich people even would like to try, and it's just like it's beyond the power. And I want to just jump in there because I think it's such an important difference to the classical outlook of a Marxist promise of revolution, where what you have to redistribute is riches, and you think that the means of production, so factories or platforms, should be owned collectively so that they can be democratically controlled. But that's wealth, right? But we now live in a world where there's so much waste and even toxic substances that also need to be, redistributed, or rather kind of dealt with in a responsible manner, that need to be, we need to somehow readopt that stuff as well.
I'm wondering, when you talk about the negative aspects of the freedom of property rights, Is it enough? Would it be enough to regulate and control and set demands on owners of property? Or do we need a different conceptual logic to our view of what property means and is?
So I definitely think we need a different paradigm of property that prioritizes the stewardship and the care for something over the sort of despotic volition to do whatever. So this full total dominion is the juridical term. But I have no kind of triumphant pride of a critical theorist who wants to say everything else that you try this is not good. I prove to you how it's all bound to fail. I mean, I think it's not a situation we're in. It would be, I mean, at the moment, for instance, emissions are still rising every year. Like, if I would love to have a capitalism that at least pretends to be green, then I will have a critique of how I think it will never manage to. But we're not even in that situation. It hasn't even been appropriated, our critique. So, and I do think about property rights. So we do need also drastic redistribution. Like the inequality of wealth in the world at the moment is staggering. Like it's far exceeding any feudal disparities. But we also, I think, could, with sort of intermediate steps, get used to a more caring attitude to objects. You could regulate property so that, like, slowly certain things become seen as absurd and illegal and other things are encouraged. The trouble is, if you make those small changes, they usually seem to people as if you just lose freedom. I mean, already, you cannot cut in German law, you cannot cut a tree in your garden if it's bigger than 10 centimeters. But, for a motorway, then whole forests get cut down. So there's such an absurdity of who can do what. And still, if you make kind of those small reforms, you often breed a lot of resentment. I sometimes think if we did more drastic and courageous changes that really said, nobody can use their property in a way that harms the common foundations of life. Nobody can kind of even have property on things that are global commons. I think it would actually be easier to democratically decide on that than piecemeal sort of, oh, you mustn't do this and you mustn't do that.
But what have been developing the last 400 years is a little bit this concept of, as you mentioned in the beginning, like property is mine to do what I wish with. And the current Clearcut Forestry, for example. The general outset is, of course, I have the right to clear cut a whole forest and replant it with a monoculture that destroys biodiversity. That's my right, and any limitation to that right is a negative change to my freedom. How do you help this person to see that in the interest of general increased freedom, this is an illogical choice?
So also, I think there are many other people who should maybe be helped before that person. But I would start by pointing out that this notion of property came up in a world, so Locke, over 300 years ago, that had completely different assumptions about how our world was made up, right? The concept of property that we have still enshrined in law, and that I think also is indispensable for capitalism, was built under the assumption that there's infinite space on, like, uncultivated space, on the surface. That was, of course, wrong then already. It already presupposed the dispossession of indigenous people. But there was this idea there's lots of unused land. It's not true at all anymore. And B, the second idea, cultivated land, the more intensively cultivated, the more productive. There's no idea that the kind of clear cutting in order to grow something or have a monoculture forest that grows faster, there was no understanding that could, over a longer time period, lead to the degradation. And this is, I mean, Locke didn't know. And if you read him, he's very concerned about things going to waste and rotting. He just thought it's only perishable fruits that rot. He didn't think that land could collapse. It was just not in the science of the day, right? And plus, he thought the world was 6,000 years old and given to us by God, right? We now know it's over 4.5 billion years old. Like, there's a so
at least
now,
the majority knows that, yeah.
Yes, that is also a problem. It depends on if the forest owner is also an evangelical Christian, then I would have a very different strategy. Then I would try to say what incredible suffering to children in the future this will bring, that there is no proper forest anymore. But also that often doesn't help, because if people care about there are lots of children suffering now if it doesn't move people to to live a more accept justice, then I don't think why future generations should make them accept that, unless they only think of their own grandchildren, and that already presupposes a kind of division of the world to favor your own kind. Anyway, so yeah, that's what I would say, that we have to try to justify property rights with regard to what we know about our current world. And I would also talk, a lot of the people who do damage also, I know farmers better than foresters, I guess. They're not plowing the land because they think it's great that they exert their power over it. They know that they're dependent on certain subsidies that also require that you till the land. That's dependent on, as you said, the very low price they get for the grain. So if you could kind of also restore some of their pride over and the knowledge about the land, and be like, okay, you're relieved of all this. You don't need to sell anymore. What would be the best thing you do with your land? I think some people would actually make surprising turns. So those systemic pressures of competition that I spoke about earlier, you need to lift them before you hold people accountable for what they're doing.
What would you say about the knowledge about the understanding that if we give life more freedom, if we give biodiversity more space, if we give human interactions rather than transactions more space in our life, how would you talk about this as a freedom increasing force? Or is this intuitively understood, or do we need people help to guide this intellectual route?
Yeah, I think sometimes people intuitively understand if you are surrounded by kind of kindness and helpfulness, you feel much more free because you can trust that this might go on than if you're surrounded by resentful servants, where if you stop paying attention, to keep them dominated, they might rise against you, right? So there is and also with nature, if you are in a garden where things grow kind of somewhat also by themselves, and where you don't have to all the time fight off the next catastrophic whatever insect or weather event, there is a certain sense of peace that I think has to do with freedom. And that's of course why in socialist tradition we always say no one is free until all are. And if you show why that really is the case and not just a kind of moral law, then you have to say, well, that's because even those who dominate are not free, because dominating is just one thing, and just being forced to keep doing the one thing isn't being free. And my specific turn would always be to say, look, think about it over a longer term. Think that you don't want to just now be free and do whatever you can with your will. That's as if you look geometrically, from a bird's eye view on that moment. What can I do now? Okay, can I cut it down? No, I can't cut it down. Whoa, that's less freedom. But if you think, well, what would it take for you to stay free? How, you can cut it down once, then it's gone. How couldn't you think that every species in that forest, that every kind of tree that grows is something you can interact with? There's so many more possibilities. Freedom is about possibility, right? So if you let other things live and let them live freely, you can continue to interact in all sorts of sort of free ways with them. That seems to me to be a massive increase of freedom. But I do think we have to, on the critical side, when I talked about poverty and I talked about this individual that owns themselves, that's of course a fiction. Nobody can survive by themselves. But the trouble is that modernity has not just made the natural world ownable, it has also made some people ownable, or partly ownable, some of their time ownable, to others. Often then also those people were associated with nature, not because they were sort of more natural than any other human animal, but because they were propertized. So was nature. So for the drastic case, of course, slavery, where Black people were really seen as proto-property and as ownable by people in chattel slavery. And also patriarchy has this effect that if she's not enslaved, then not the woman as a whole, but her reproductive capacity, so her the time that she puts into nurture, also actually under classical marriage law, her labor power, and her own right to own property. It's like a parcel that you get ownership over. It's really phrased in those terms, at least in both the English common law and the Code Napoleon, and as a husband. So you own parts. And also it means women are partly ownable. And this kind of allows people to hide the dependency that they have on the outer world in this sovereignty. So I just own the woman, she's mine, so she cares for me, but I don't even need to admit that I'm dependent, because it's almost like it's happening naturally, or it's an aspect of that object that I own that I get looked after. And that makes none of the ends of this relation happy, but it's kind of toxic and addictive, and also maybe gives you that kind of fear that if that woman was free, she might not look after you anymore, and then who will? So, and same of if that piece of land, if you couldn't press all the productivity out of it anymore, maybe you might go bankrupt because nobody will help you then. It's capitalism, somebody else takes over. So you have to, that it's really deeply ingrained, this kind of possessiveness. In my work, I call when it's not actual dominion anymore, where the law gives you the right to own somebody else's time or even body, then there's still this kind of sense of entitlement. They call it phantom possession. Like it's almost like a phantom limb, you it's not there, but you feel the pain. So it's phantom domination. You're not actually entitled anymore to rule in that way over another person, but you still feel this urge to control. And a lot of what we see and sort of, as a Me Too movement and in the kind of pervasive racism in white societies, also in Europe especially, then anti-immigrant racism as well, like where you have this idea as if some people were allowed to decide where other people should be. Like, it's like an object that you put on this shelf or camp or that shelf. Like there is this very ingrained urge to dominate, that I call phantom possession, and that's mistaken as freedom. And it's, that's actually unfreedom, because it ties you to a kind of hollow usurpation of other people's lives. It makes you totally dependent. Also, fortunately, then it is very shaky now because there is lots of counter-organization. But that's also a force one has to reckon with. And so if you want to go back to this guy who wants to cut down, or it might be a woman, her forest, it depends on whether, if she's really only seeking profit, then ease the competition and she'll probably treat the land much better. But if she also has a kind of fantasy of sovereign control and thinks her freedom is only proven if she can really treat this forest as if it were dead, then it's difficult. And you just need to build a lot of counter power.
And sometimes maybe people feel that I've lost control, I've lost power in the society, and at least this I control. So this will to dominate this remaining part is kind of a illogical compensation for loss of a perceived power. Is that also a factor?
Yes, I come from the Frankfurt School tradition partly in my thinking, and that one of the key theoretical ingredients is ideology. So what we have to explain is why a lot of people who don't even fully benefit from the societies we live in still uphold them. And I think the property regime, a lot of people buy into it because it at least offers them this consoling fantasy that there might be something that they get that they can hold on to. And it's often very dark, like it's often also then it shifts. For instance, in South Africa at the end of apartheid, the rate of femicides and domestic violence in white families extremely increased. And you could sort of see that a certain entitlement. It wasn't like an actual process where it's kind of worked through that you go beyond domination. It's kind of just shifted to another site then, because there wasn't the kind of hyper-exploited Black community to absorb that violence. It kind of went somewhere else. And I think in neoliberalism, there is, of course, a general sense of dispossession, and also it's a very real. So, and there I would say, it, like in the South African example, it's kind of one type of phantom possession gets translated by another phantom possession. It's kind of rotten all the way down. But in our current world, if you think about material property, like if people have a house, they can't be sure anymore that it won't like be hit by natural, so-called, now we know it's not entirely nature-produced disaster. So there is, and with an ever kind of ever faster global competition, you also don't know, and inflation, you don't know whether your wage will pay for life in a few years. So there is also acute justified pain of dispossession and uncontrollability that then makes certain ideological domains of sort of fantasy control so attractive. And I think that's why we have to give each other real security, right? We need to actually fix the world. We need to kind of stop that competition. We need to promise each other that if one house gets flooded, you share the other house. Like, then that would be the antidote, and not the kind of hollow, what I often call it, a kind of compensation of the propertyless by the powerless, so that you get the kind of hollow control over another group that is designated as inferior and as kind of ownable by you. Capitalism, of course, always has used this ideological control over certain and like devalued groups to keep its people kind of on its side. That's ideology.
But also you mentioned before, like the feeling and sense of security. In the neoliberal and capitalist logic, it's more like transaction between objects and people rather than actually interdependence and relations. And for real security to happen, as you mentioned, like we are interdependent of both each other and nature. How is that possible to ingrain in the current economic agenda, so to speak?
Well, in the current economic agenda, it's not possible, I guess. I mean, I think it's possible to ingrain or to see it sprouting in the resistance or in certain interstices of the current economical agenda. So one thing that especially feminist Marxists often point out is that, of course, this whole world, this whole system would kind of fly apart instantaneously if there wasn't certain forms of unpaid care labor, and also just like little bits of human kindness, that and also bits of like maintenance and sort of looking after infrastructures that isn't fully enforced, like just that people don't all dump their rubbish everywhere as soon as somebody doesn't look. Like there's certain things that we might not even think of that come from human decency that make this life livable. But what we see is that more and more time is propertized so that it can be kind of absorbed by the market and used for something that becomes a paid transaction, and that you can kind of buy your wellness and not rely on some free time that you actually spend in a good environment with nice people that also have free time. But there is always a kind of substance of society that is caring and reproducing, otherwise nothing would live. And my argument in the New Freedom book is that when we talk about nature, I think we should call it regeneration rather than reproduction, because it's not intentional. Like the tree doesn't be like, oh, I want to make oxygen to allow humans to breathe. It's just that's its life. It just lives, and then we can live. Like that's because we have a kind of long history of evolution that we share, and this beautiful 12,000 years of Holocene where all this kind of richness and abundance with many, many different ecosystems develop. So I think that's something we see, and that capitalism also depends on that as a whole. And some forms of resistance these days are very much, I think, centered around an awareness of exhaustion. So this whole wave, of course, we also see, and that's great, more unionized struggles, but there's also this whole wave of quitting and quiet quitting and like people just walking out of their jobs. And I also see it with younger people, also in sort of very privileged context in academia, that suddenly this whole promise that, yes, you burn yourself out now, but then you get the status later, people don't buy it anymore. There is a kind of fleeing to regeneration, or feeling like if I don't get enough sleep now, I'll never get up. And an extreme forward, that is the lying flat movement in China, where young people really opt out of this whole kind of promise. And it's really the promise, to get a family home, to have a family, to have a car, to work your way up, to have a job, to stay with that company, to be like, no, I don't get up anymore. Like I sleep, and I stay on a friend's sofa and I sleep. That also is protest, not just what we do screaming in the street.
En passant, you mentioned about the tree that was growing and then weakening. I think that's kind of an interesting aspect, because even if the tree's life force is weakening, it becomes home for hundreds of new species that increases life and strength. So maybe we could see each other a little bit about the tree, that like my life is not only my life, it's part of a bigger context.
It's very important you bring it up, because people often accuse me of being too romantic about nature, like as if like everything just beautifully goes together and there wasn't any death. And of course there is death. That's the whole thing. Like humans need to finally accept their own finitude. And of course, there's also finitude in nature. A tree eventually dies. But unlike the systems that we have set up that produce destructive, toxic waste, that like lots of things will also outlive me, that will destroy other life. The way that a tree dies, it produces lots of things that allows and enables other life and that feed into other life cycles. And I think having an awareness of something with such integrity survives you is the best consolation we can get. I also think we shouldn't be too quick with it. Like I sometimes hear people like, oh, well, yeah, everything get compost and eventually we compost and isn't that great? I mean, death is hard. Like human death, we have an idea, a notion of time and projects and planning that I would think a tree has not. And that doesn't make the tree, I mean, humans are not that great. I don't think it's an insult to the tree. I think rather it's insulting if you want to make everything in the natural world like us. Like the tree has this kind of very dignified way of being involved in lots of cycles of life. But still the death of the human has another tragedy to it than the death of a tree. But yet find consolation in the way in which our creaturely life is like the tree, that it can rot in a good way also. And then, yeah, life goes on. It's beautiful.
So let's say now our listeners follow your thought here. They think, yeah, that's a good idea. We should redefine what freedom is. What kind of policy steps would the EU need to take? What could be the first little steps on this route to redefine the concept of freedom?
This will sound very counterintuitive after I said it's about freedom to stay and temporal freedom, but I think the first policy step the EU has to take is to say we open the borders unconditionally. Everybody who wants to live here and believes in our societies is welcome. That's actually the strength. That's amazing. I mean, that people still believe in any political promise. But then, of course, we have to share resources very justly. We have to make everyone safe. We also need to think what to do with areas where then maybe suddenly less people live. And even in Europe, we need to make sure to reforest lots of things. So I think the second or simultaneous step would be to fix the global food system. So Europe will have to abandon this absurd maize biofuel growing, have more wind and offshore energy, but also save energy overall drastically, then use some of that land for kind of very local sort of food sovereignty, allowing farming and community supported agricultures, but also reforest some bits to make sure that habitats stay healthy over a long time, rewild bits, see how the global food chain is balanced, how we obviously immediately stop importing anything that partakes in the destruction, not just of the rainforest, the Amazon, also mangrove forests, and obviously forbid any farming that isn't ecological farming. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's easy for me to say. I don't think it will work because people have, for instance, a phantom possession that makes them think their country shouldn't be, it's their country, it's a property, it shouldn't be allowed people to come in.
That was a nice case of mind reading, because I was actually wanting to go back to the phantom possession logic. Like, how would you then deal with people's conception of phantom possession, and not only about the people feeling entitled by it, but also the people's a victim of it, because some people accept or at least subjugate to their role in the phantom possession structure. How can we liberate both sides from this logic?
Well, I do think people are very struck by both kindness and justice. So what we haven't tried in the whole energy crisis now, for instance, is to ration energy in an egalitarian way. So we have all those kind of tinkering with caps or lowering the overall price. But then if you are a millionaire with a big house, then you get also that reduction. But if you just said everybody gets the same, and by the way, those people who arrived here newly, they also get the same. But everybody gets the same, and you can trust that nobody has more. And actually then with the toy, I love this example with energy. I actually live in a very big old house shared with friends. I actually freeze now. That's great. It's my choice. Like, I want to have a palace. I get so and so many kilowatt hours of heating. I can decide to freeze a bit more. I'm actually super happy with that. Somebody who lives with a big family in a small flat, they will have it warm and cozy, That would have been possible. We didn't do that. And that's actually another German economist, Ulrike Hermann, who wrote about the post-war British economy of rationing and how that is actually an example. And I think that could be an important intermediate step that makes people aware that there is a finite set of resources, but if it's shared really, like all the things that you need for basic life, if that's shared evenly, it does give you a certain, you can kind of relax from all the competition. And if you trust that this is how it will go on, then also you don't have this anxiety that you might be the one who, because you did something wrong, like then you lose your house or you can't heat your heating bill and somebody else can. I mean, some of the racism is also fueled anyway in a competitive society where the more people there are, you feel like the more you can lose, because they're the same also with like integrating women in the workforce. If all it means is that there's more competition, you kind of give no one a break. So you have to create areas, and I would say living, eating, housing, and heating are areas where there just shouldn't be dependent on how you stand in competition. It's like you're human, you gotta have a shelter.
Many people talk about basic income, but when you talk about the duration of electricity, that would be like a basic electricity income to everybody
Yeah.
who has the right.
Yeah, and with the basic income, I think there's a huge problem if you keep that kind of global division of labor that we have,
Yeah.
where our cheap consumer goods depend on terrible exploitative conditions, both economically and ecologically elsewhere. Then somehow it's you're cheating. I mean, it's still great to allow, as long as you have nation states, then sure, but and also that's the kind of population whose data traces that they leave on the internet are also valuable. Then you have free time, you just surf around, you get targeting advertisement, and you buy the stuff that is produced under terrible conditions elsewhere. Like somehow I think this isn't scalable in the way that egalitarian distribution is. However, I do think rationing is always a kind of crisis and emergency measure. What we really need is to restructure the core bits of economy, and the fact that under COVID we haven't even started anywhere doing that with the health system, I think gives us very dire prospects of how little political will there is to democratize and socialize those life-sustaining areas, and then run them not for profit, but run them need-oriented and in a kind of caring way. And that you're saying mental health crisis, so there's so much need for repair and help, even in so-called very privileged societies. There's so much despair also of people who have kind of, in some sense, good prospects in life comparatively, but only comparatively, like, and still like there's terrible waiting lists for therapy places. Here in the UK now, it's very hard to even get into the hospitals because you have 4 hours average that you call an ambulance.
In which way does neoliberal economy and capitalist economy affect this sentiment?
Well, I think that this is a kind of queer link, as in the dialectical opposite. So neoliberalism is the ideology that ever more things should be run on market principles, and that individual responsibility and competition are good ways to order a society. It's kind of hiding all the dependencies that we have. So if you stop hiding them, say the individual isn't responsible, then the political collective is and has to take democratic decisions of how, for instance, we want to run a health system, how we want to run an elderly care system, so that everyone can feel that they're essential and essential to everyone, not just sort of lonely, self-owning, cut out bits of person.
So in a neoliberal system, like you slash the funding for healthcare, and at the same time you put the individual responsible for the lack of healthcare because you gave them an opportunity to have a choice that wasn't real but fake, then you start to have this process of you put the blame on yourself for your ailments rather than the poor organization of society.
Yeah, and think you should have gone running more or something. And also you feel terrible then if whatever your family faces an unlivable choice between either, if you're an old person, for instance, either looking after you besides their work or abandoning you in a badly funded care home. It's kind of no surprise that people are nervous and afraid, because so many of the social democratic gains of security of social welfare have been cut or undermined. The official promise of security is one that where security comes after property. Like part of the promise is property is like it's yours, and then it's got to be secured for the future. You have it, and then you are safe. But I think we need to think about what depropertized security would be. What security would be that doesn't go through that channel of individual ownership, but then goes through the channel of collective solidarity.
How do we help people to feel secure in the transition?
Yeah. So, I would always again stress for how few people that is the case, right? It's mostly only working anymore if you actually inherit the property, like the whole meritocracy of working hard and then you can afford a house. It's over. And I think a lot of people who inherit also have uneasy feelings about it because they know there is a weird, like, they haven't earned it in a way, and also then they get attacked all the time and people criticize them for it, and it's not their fault. But one of the ways that I think about social change is I call it interstitial change. So that sometimes every even radical shift starts with things that at first seem like anomalies, like something weird, something like that doesn't fit, something that you might not even like. It's kind of a disturbing factor. And it's kind of small context in which something new gets tried out. And I think if social movements manage to open a space for this thought of actually preserving life and regenerating life rather than owning and destroying it, that's not nothing. I do think it can reach and convince people. And if it doesn't, then sometimes that's not a weakness of the theory. It's a problem with the world, It doesn't mean that I should stop trying.
People have tried to make change before, and sometimes successfully and sometimes not. Your book talked about kind of revolutionary change, and then actually I think I should ask you to define what revolution is then, because many people have a misconception, or at least a different conception of it.
Yeah, that's a bit more in my older work that for me, I think we can't just drop the notion of revolution because it's too bloody or because we don't like some of the militant fantasy attached to it, because it just is the word we have for the maximal range of change. It's just the most far-reaching concept that we have for transformation. And also it's a concept that since the French Revolution at least designates that change can be human, like man-made. It's not something that happens by fate. It's something that we make. And you need it. I think we don't even understand what politics is if we don't have that concept. Everything that we value now, human rights, democracy, came about. It's born, it's made by revolution. Like that's how it came about. It's not somehow slowly emerged by consensus and convincing even the last sort of feudal lord that it would be a nice idea to have human rights. But at the same time, I think it's a real misconception if when we say revolution, we always think of the Bastille and some kind of one big event and singular, like you storm something, especially for the problems that we have now, where it feels as though getting state power, which is what those imaginaries of storming the Winter Palace or storming the Bastille are about, would even not do very much, because there's all the kind of international network of the economy, there's all the global reach of markets, there's the ecological destruction. What do you store? So I think even for something like the French Revolution, a very classical model of revolution, a better way to understand it is to see how it's actually a very long process where new practices, in the case of French Revolution, also of popular sovereignty, so founding clubs, founding societies, discussing village matters, having those complaint lists before the French Revolutions, lots of little practices that sort of add up to suddenly a new paradigm. And if you ask me how I define revolution, I would say that something that was unthinkable before becomes the new matter of course, like the thing that you don't even notice because it's so like ubiquitous. So for instance, something like the idea that we have human rights is something that, in a feudal system, it would just be, it's unintelligible. And then now that's politics. It's even hard to think about politics as something else, as, okay, what rights should something have? And that's at the moment, we're now at that framework of politics, it's reaching a real limit because the natural world and the regenerative capacity of both ecosystems and humans, it's not something that you can easily put into a right. And I would, of course, say rights themselves kind of are derived from property. It's an analogy to you can own something, an outer thing, and then kind of progressive liberal politics say, well, but you also own your freedom. You have a right, and then freedom of opinion and religion and certain things that nobody can mess with, it can't interfere. And yeah, that of course was great compared to a situation where you had religious civil wars and all that. Not that they've gone away entirely at all, but this will not help you transition into kind of sharing of time with the forest where like your life freedom is enhanced. So yeah, that's why I think we need to look what current social movements, they're kind of laboratories for far-reaching new ideas. And then once you've discerned them, you will also see that they've been around for a long time, and it's not new. It's definitely not something that America came up with, the idea that you could depropertize social relations. It's a lot of anti-colonial struggle for hundreds of years has tried that. But I think the fact that so many social movements at present actually talk about life, and it's interesting. Like there is a shift. It's not civil rights. It's also not primarily at first redistribution, but there is a rich understanding of entangled, precarious lives, sort of with a deep understanding of which lives are affected more by those two cuts, of capitalism slashing in half and encircling. The Black Lives Matter, also Latin American feminism, where it always starts from a particular type of death dealings, for instance, femicides, but then it has this positive notion of we want ourselves alive, free and debt free, is what Neo Namenos often says. And now this breathtakingly and courageous and impressive, it's really humbling to watch the Iranian revolution unfold, right? And they have that Kurdish feminist slogan, woman, life, freedom, which also has life in there. Like the freedom is not that we can deal death. The freedom is we live from that life. If you open it to other lives in the right way, it can become free.
Maybe it's a relief to some people that the revolution is not necessarily picking up a pitchfork and storming the Bastille, but actually, like, it's a process that starts early with cooperation, with understanding of the oppressive systems and so on. But what makes a revolution successful? We saw a lot of the revolutions in 1848 that started with, the potato pests and the rye failure, and then people got starvation, and then suddenly groups with different interests helped each other out. So like the economically poor fought together with the liberal rights-focused people in the cities, and they managed to overturn it, but they lost. The old monarchy powers came back in Germany, in Italy, and in France, and so on. They had a counter power, and not only in Europe, like the East Indian Company, who really owned and run India at the time, they had a revolution there too, but it also failed. And the same with the Taiping revolution in China. You had all these revolutions. You had groups of people. You had nationalists. You had economically poor. You had liberals. Everybody knew this system is wrong, and we have a common enemy. But how do you make it successful afterwards? Like the transition doesn't benefit your new oppressive regime or group.
Several things to say about that. Well, it's interesting you bring up 1848, because one of the ways in which revolutions failed there was already something that I think you could call right-wing populism, like, for instance, appealing to kind of nationalist phantom possession and a kind of common, very undifferentiated, but kind of entitlement that then was used to squash the more far-reaching radical hopes and the democratic hopes. And that brings me to the second thing. I feel there is sometimes a misconception. Social change or a revolution is not horse betting. So it might be that the concept of revolution you have still is not very likely to win. Like, you don't choose the transformation project. Like, if I was going to bet my money, I'm probably going to bet it on fascism at the moment. But that's not
let's hope you lose your money then.
Yes, exactly. So make me lose my money, right? That's what I anyway want. I anyway want to lose my money because I want to have a socialist revolution. But you need to decide what you do with your life. And one of the scarcest resources in neoliberalism and on a dying planet is living a meaningful life. I mean, people crave meaning and sense, and the more you realize that also you will die, and those you love will also die. Like, what you do with that time, something meaningful. And so I do think that's maybe a better way to say why one should live a life of care and solidarity rather than one of property and entitlement, because it's meaningful and you'll also feel it even if you lose.
We always in Western society kind of tend to look at the end result and not the journey. And if the purpose is a meaningful life, doing meaningful things gives you kind of sentiment of well-being, even if the ultimate struggle fails during your generation, it's still giving you a good life.
Yeah, it's also giving you a hard life, but it's giving you the right life. Yeah, a meaningful life, a life that you would want to live again, or that you think could be an example for somebody else to live. That's a big grace if sort of your circumstances allow that to you. Yeah, there is also a way in which the model of solidarity is the right model also in catastrophe or in losing. So best idea is to cooperate and share and try to regenerate, try to see and kind of help ecosystems rebalance and see what can stabilize and in what ways, what can be protected, what can be transformed.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.